Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this session. And today we have Dr. Francine Foss, who many of you probably know or have heard of, but Dr. Foss joins us from Connecticut and Yale. She's a hematologist and oncologist specializing in T-cell lymphomas. Thank you, Dr. Foss, for joining us today. It's really an honor to have you.
Thank you, Susan, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be here to talk to you today and also to talk to all of our patients around the world.
Yeah, and I'll start off by saying, first, and I probably have never been able to do this publicly, so I'm taking a little bit of liberty here, but you were probably one of the first hematologists to really take on cutaneous lymphoma. As best as I can tell, looking kind of back at the history. And then you've also been one of the clinicians early on who really embraced the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation and the work that our founder, Judy Jones, was doing. You've really been a partner of ours for a long time. And I just want to say thank you. And we really appreciate, you being with us and stepping into this world. So maybe we can start by letting folks know kind of how did you get into the T-cell world and cutaneous lymphoma, because from a hematology perspective, that really is not high profile, right?
Exactly. And that's an interesting story because I was lucky enough to train at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. And at that time, Ed Sossville and Paul Bunn and some of the kind of grandfathers of cutaneous lymphoma were there. So I had the pleasure of working with them and learning about the disease. And at that time that I was at the NCI, or right after I came, I should say, that pivotal clinical trial, which randomized between aggressive chemotherapy, CHOP, and conventional kind of standard radiation and PUVA and non-chemotherapy options. That randomized study was done at the NCI, and that study basically showed us that patients with cutaneous lymphoma should probably not be getting CHOP. And that, of course, bucked up against the tradition in oncology to give everybody chemotherapy. So I was coming right at the heels of that, and also some other really interesting discoveries and some really tremendous biology that was done to try to understand the disease. And some of the earliest biology and some of the attempts to get materials from patients to establish cell lines and understand the disease. So I feel like I really got in on the ground floor with the whole buildup of our understanding of cutaneous lymphoma. And then our ability to bring that into the world of hematology. So that part of it was really exciting. But just on a personal note, I just want to say that when I was in junior high school and high school, my best friend, Elizabeth, her dad actually had mycosis fungoides. Can you believe it?
Wow.
And I remember this strange skin disease, and he looked like, patchy red spots all over. And he was going up to Dartmouth, which is one of the few places that was treating the disease, and did radiation and then chemo. So for me, there's kind of a long history dating back to seeing this disease, but not knowing what I was looking at, to being at the NCI and actually being amongst people who are studying this disease. So I think those were my inspirations that really brought me to where I am today. And it's been a tremendous journey, I'll say, too.
Yeah, wow. That sounds like fate and destiny or something like that. Like you almost didn't have a choice, right? That you landed here. Yeah,
exactly.
And lucky for us that you landed here. We are so fortunate. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, you've been in the field for a while, but when you first started and you were in clinical practice, what was it like treating patients? What kinds of therapies were available, and how did you navigate that? Because things have changed a bit, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But what was it like early on in your practice?
Well, early on, as I mentioned, we were trying to learn whether or not we should give chemotherapy. But we still really had the old standbys, which were interferon and methotrexate. And interestingly, today, those drugs are still relevant. I wish that interferon wasn't going away, but that's another story that we can talk about later. But I think it's still a powerful drug in this disease. And so early on, we were really handicapped by what was available to us because we really didn't have a lot of T-cell specific therapies. And we used light and radiation and kind of standard drugs like chlorambucil and methotrexate and Cytoxan before we had a good understanding of, first of all, how this disease impacts the immune system and how cytotoxic therapies aren't helpful. But secondly, about some of the novel biological approaches that we could be using. And I think we've certainly seen the evolution of the field kind of go in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we'll take that sort of line of conversation. How has the therapy evolved, especially from your perspective on the hematology side? Because, you know, you really are a bit unique in that you come to this disease from the hematology oncology side, and yet you've also become an expert on the dermatology because of the combination of the two. So what have you seen in the years and how to treat patients and what has changed and like what have we learned?
I think one of the important things that I can say for myself, and I think it's true for every oncologist, hematologist in this field, is that it's really critical that you have derm colleagues, that you work intimately with your dermatology colleagues, and also if you have total skin radiation with your radiation therapy colleagues, because this is a disease where people are, those of us that are treating it are learning at every step. I learned a tremendous amount early on coming from the hematology world and being able to interface with my derm colleagues. I learned a tremendous amount from them. And of course, they learned from me. And I would have to say that early on, as we all know, that interface between dermatology and hematology oncology wasn't as good as it is today. So I think early on, we were somewhat handicapped by that. But we've all been able to sit in the same room and have meetings together and collaborate in a way that I think really benefits patients. I remember like one of the earliest things I did was I went to the CTCL meeting that was held every year in Copenhagen or Germany by our European colleagues. And I remember going to that meeting as a very young investigator and being surrounded by dermatologists who are almost talking like a separate language and being one of the few oncologists in the room. But all of those people became my friends and we're still friends today. And I think it's that kind of a community. So I think one of the most exciting things that happened early on is the development of the drug Ontak, which was the first therapy that was really approved after, of course, photopheresis. And that really represented the hematology oncology community coming up with a concept, which is hooking up a toxin to a cytokine, and then trying to figure out what disease that would work in. And I think because we were doing, a lot of this research early on in CTCL, and we said, hey, that's a T cell that has an IL-2 receptor. Maybe we should apply this technology. That we were able to basically steal that technology and adopt it. And it certainly, went the full, way to FDA approval. So I think that was a situation where folks who were aware of the disease and looking at the biology of the disease could adapt and adopt from what's going on around them in a research environment. And I think that's still happening today, Susan. When you look at some of the phase 1 studies that are being done with drugs that nobody thinks could even possibly be relevant in CTCL, all of a sudden we're being called by the phase 1 group and they're telling us, oh, this drug may in fact be interesting in T-cell lymphoma for X, Y, and Z reason. And do you have any patients? So I think, that interface between the two worlds has really become, much closer. And I think that benefits all the patients out there because, we want the best drugs for our patients at all times, obviously. And we need to be talking to each other in order to develop those drugs.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly exciting, even in my short tenure, as with part of the foundation and being exposed more to the science and the research. What's happened over the last 10 years has really, at least from my perspective, maybe you have a different view, but it seems to have exploded. And I don't know if that's because research itself, clinical medical research, has really taken leaps and bounds, or I don't know. Do you have a thought on that, and maybe why we're seeing so much activity, at least I think we are, in cutaneous lymphoma as a rare disease, right? It seems
Right.
really exciting.
I think it's very interesting. And whenever I give a talk about T-cell lymphoma, in particular CTCL, and you look at the incidence curves for different types of lymphoma, we know that B-cell lymphomas are more common, but the incidence of T-cell lymphomas is the same as Hodgkin's. And if you look at all the papers in the literature and all the research in Hodgkin's, it's probably 100 times as much as in T-cell lymphoma, despite the fact that there are the same number of patients out there. Now, of course, CTCL is, a fragment of T-cell lymphoma, but what we're now learning actually is that what we find works in one T-cell disease may well work in another. And so I think it's useful to think about ourselves as part of that whole kind of T-cell lymphoma group of patients and diseases. And I think one of the reasons why there's been a panoply of available therapies is because people are now doing more research in general, and because T cells are important in so many other areas and so many other kinds of tumors in the microenvironment. And people are more interested in studying the biology of T cells. That's been fortunate for us in the CTCL world, because prior to this, as you know, Susan, people didn't care too much about T cells. There were probably a handful of companies that had even heard the term CTCL. Nowadays, myself and other investigators are getting called by companies that we don't know the names of, who actually have chemicals or biologics or whatever that might be interesting for our patients. So I think a lot of that is driven by advances in research, working together as an international community, learning about the importance of T cells, normal T cells in the microenvironment in our bodies in general, and how they contribute to all kinds of cancers in the microenvironment. And then again, focusing back in on CTCL. By the way, CTCL is really a great disease to study if you're developing a drug, because as you know, our patients wear their disease on their skin. Other patients with solid tumors, in order to know what's going on with the treatment, you've got to get an imaging study. Our patients can come in and tell us whether or not they're responding to a treatment. And that's really an advantage when you're trying to study a drug and understand how that drug works, that you can actually visualize the cancer at all times, but also you can easily biopsy and look at various molecular and other features of the cancer that might help you to understand really how your drug is working. So I think CTCL patients should really give themselves credit, because I think you're really contributing to the advancement of knowledge, particularly if you participate in any of these clinical trials.
Wow, I had never thought of it quite that way. So thank you for framing that. And I think that is a good point too. I think one of the reasons I am so passionate about educating our patient community globally around the science and what's happening in research is because we need to participate, in the clinical trials, or in donating our specimens and things. It's not always clinical trial. Some of the research really requires specimens and to do those kinds of really early on studies, right? So we need to participate. And the more we learn and the more we understand, I think people want to participate, but they don't always understand what's being asked of them, or why, or how does this contribute, those kinds of things. Wow, that's
exactly.
cool. I love talking to everybody about this stuff, because it gives me,
And I think, again, I want to give kudos to our CTCL patients, because oftentimes they come in to me and they say, you know, can I contribute blood? Can I contribute tissue? What can I do for research? And I think that's really an amazing attitude for our folks, our patients to have. Again, most people appreciate the fact that they have a rare disease that's not that well understood. And we're only going to learn really because they participate in the science. They're an active part of science and research, even if they're not on a trial. And I think that's true now because, as you know, a lot of us are sequencing these tumors to try to understand them from a molecular point of view. And you really need to have like thousands of cases in order to figure things out, like, well, why does this patient have more aggressive disease? And why did that patient respond to PUVA? And which patient should get interferon, for instance? These are all questions we could answer better if we understood the genetics of all of our, you know, tumors in all of our patients. So I think that's really a direction research, you know, should be going in this field.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And maybe you can talk a little bit about where we are today with regards to, you mentioned sequencing and things. And I think sometimes from a patient perspective, you know, you hear all this scientific terminology and different kinds of studies, but maybe you could speak a little bit about what does that mean when someone says we're sequencing your tumor, or what does that tell you, and why is that important?
So there's a couple of things to, I guess, talk about there. Number one would be when you take a tumor biopsy from me, a piece of skin, and you say that you're going to do research on it, what are you doing? I like to kind of break that down by saying that there's really a couple of things we can do. First of all, we can actually look at the tumor cells themselves. So we can actually get those tumor cells out of the skin biopsy or out of the blood, and we can isolate those tumor cells specifically. Then we can basically grind them up and expose them to a chemical process that will liberate the DNA, which of course is the coding sequence for the genes. We can then put that through these big fancy machines that will effectively sequence all of those genes and give us a readout of what those gene signatures are, what those genes are. All of that data could be a lot of mumbo jumbo, but it actually gets put into these gigantic computer systems that can compare it to other people and can identify if you have specific mutations in those genes, and which genes have the mutations, and how many. And all of that really helps us with research, because, for instance, if we find that many of the CTCL patients have a mutation in a gene called CCR4 that our drug mogamulizumab targets, then perhaps we can understand, oh, the ones with the mutation did better or did worse. Otherwise, we're not going to really understand why some people do better and some do worse. Maybe it's not that gene, maybe it's another gene. But unless we have that very basic information, we're not going to be able to understand why that tumor does what it does. So getting information about your genes is really critically important, and we get that from a biopsy. But the other thing I want to talk about, because this is really a big direction that we're going in right now, is not only the tumor cells, but those tumor cells live in a microenvironment. They live in a neighborhood, and they're affected by their neighbors the same way that you're affected by your neighbors. There are good neighbors and bad neighbors, of course. And we can now, using a lot of sophisticated technology and buzzwords like microenvironment and single cell analysis and, you know, immune microenvironment and checkpoint inhibitors and suppressive environment, like these are all buzzwords basically, which describe what is happening with your neighbors. So how are those neighboring cells affecting those tumor cells? How are they influencing the clinical course of your CTCL? It's important to understand that, because first of all, we can now target and affect those microenvironment cells that aren't our tumor cells. And some of our treatments actually don't even focus on the tumor anymore. They focus on those microenvironment cells. So I think that's a critical thing to understand. And interrupting whatever the talk is between the tumor cells and the microenvironment has shown to actually help us in a lot of instances. And this is also important to me because one of my interests is in looking at not kind of a short-term, but a long-term potential cure of this disease, or putting the disease in remission for a long term. And one way you can do that is to potentially affect how those neighbors affect the tumor cells, and whether those neighbors see those tumor cells as enemies that the body needs to destroy. Because ultimately, if your body can recognize and destroy its enemies, you won't get sick, or you won't be sick. And so the two approaches that we have to treating cancer in general are, first of all, attack and kill those tumor cells with your drugs. But we never kill all the tumor cells. There's still some left behind. So if you don't have that second mechanism, which is teach the body to go after those and kill them on its own, then you're never going to keep a patient out of trouble for the long term. So it's become very complicated, really, like how we approach these diseases. But I think that's a good thing, because it represents, a better understanding of what we're doing.
Wow. I think that is one of the best descriptions of the microenvironment that I've ever heard. That's brilliant. Thank you for sharing. Because I think, again, from the patient perspective, I have a front row seat often to the science and the research and things, because I attend the meetings and then try to extrapolate that into what might be important. But I think really being able to share that, and how we in the field of cutaneous lymphomas are able to take advantage of the technology as it's been changing, the large data crunching, the new ways of being able to really drill down into these other components. And I think your point is so well taken. It's not just killing the cancer cells, but how do we retrain our bodies to recognize them and do their job? And from what I always understand, our disease is fascinating, complex, nothing is straightforward, and there's so much to it. Like, there will probably, I love your idea that you see a cure in the future, but I think even just being able to think about putting the disease into remission for a long period of time, particularly for people with more aggressive and advanced disease, gives everyone so much hope, right?
I think that, I think, Susan, there's a lot of hope out there. But while you were talking, I just want to mention one thing, which is I think that CTCL patients and doctors actually are way ahead of the curve in terms of what I talked about with killing the tumor cell in the microenvironment, because we, for a very long time, have been giving combination therapies. We've been using retinoids and interferon and photopheresis and retinoids and, various combinations thereof, and, layering on multiple therapies. Many of our patients are taking, 2 or 3 different things. Even topical steroids can affect the microenvironment. So we've really been kind of using that approach without understanding like what we're doing. And I think leading the charge in terms of understanding the concept that you really, you really need to be multifaceted when you treat a disease, and not just say, okay, you're going to get this drug and we're going to forget about all your topicals and all your, constitutional symptoms and everything else that's important. So I think we have to give ourselves credit there. And I also want to touch on the issue of talking about cure, because this is always a scary thing with any disease where you don't have a clear track record. And I think, it's certainly been true if patients look at the literature and whatever, that's certainly been true that only a small proportion of people got cured in the past. I think that's changing. And I advise people not to focus too much on those old statistics, because things are really, changing, year upon year. And I can tell you, I've got a number of patients that I've cured that have never had a recurrence of their disease. And it's across a spectrum of all different types of disease with all different types of treatments. And I truly believe that you can cure this disease in, some patients more every year. And I think as these new treatments come and get layered on, I like to tell people there's always hope, because I never even know what the new thing's going to be next year. And maybe we'll be talking about a year from now, we'll be talking about CAR T for MF. That's just starting, and who knows where that's going to go. So I think, we need to keep an open mind as science evolves and we learn how to give these treatments better to patients, that there's going to be more people with a positive, response.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that one. I always, when folks call us, and I always say, it's definitely an art to treating this disease, because it's such an individual thing. Most, the terminology that we hear often is you've seen one patient. And I think we've learned that through some of the science as well, and looking at the sequencing and so forth, that there's not a lot of similarities, right? Which makes it really challenging.
Right.
And then it becomes I think the other component is the importance of patients being able to see a specialist and an expert in the field. While again, in my 10 years of being in this position, I've seen the numbers grow, which is really exciting. When we were at the World Congress in Barcelona, just before the shutdown in 2020, there were 400 scientists, researchers, a lot of younger clinicians and researchers, which was so fabulous for me to see from a patient perspective. In a rare disease, we need experts in the field, and we could use more people, but I think that kind of access is important.
And I think from that point of view, what we on the clinician side have learned from COVID, and I think our insurance colleagues have learned, is that telemedicine is actually a good thing. And I don't know why we didn't think about it sooner, because telemedicine really allows us to access patients without them having to travel here. And in particular, like we can now even do phone visits. And patients can therefore access an expert and stay within their community, not leave the doctors that they have faith in, that have been taking care of them. But on the other hand, have access to having their case reviewed, having a face-to-face visit with an expert, and having that kind of ongoing relationship as well. We've been doing a lot of telehealth, and because we've had a lot of COVID, and it's very interesting to see how creative people get on the screen in terms of showing me their lesions. One of the things we can do that's really helpful, and I tell people to do, is take pictures ahead of time and load them into the medical record system. But I do think telehealth can really work. And I hope in the future that our insurance company kind of colleagues will understand the value of this and continue it beyond COVID, because I think that's certainly a way for us to really provide, access to more of the community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And some of the other sessions that we're having during this program is looking at the different health systems from US, Canada, Europe, and what's happening and how they work. And then also, we're very active in the policy arena, because a lot of that kind of work, and especially here in the US with reimbursement and who's going to pay for what and where you use telehealth, I am really hopeful maybe that's a small silver lining to COVID, that we can really shift that. Because you know very well, as a center of expertise, you're seeing people from all over. And if there's a way that that patients can access that expertise, but not have to leave their home, and can do better, we can do a better job of providing that expertise back into the community. And then I think we'll have better reach, better treatment. Hopefully people will get the right treatments at the right time a little more often. because
Exactly. And, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Susan and the CLF, because you guys do a tremendous amount on the advocacy front. And we certainly wouldn't be able to be doing what we're doing today if it wasn't for the support that you're giving us. And of course, for the patients in the audience who don't know this, Susan actually comes to all of our meetings. I've never been to a CTCL meeting without seeing Susan. So she is really, really on the job 24/7. And I would appreciate anything you can do with that telehealth initiative, because I think that is critically important for our patients.
Yeah, I will definitely let you know. We're working with some other rare disease collaborative groups, particularly here in the US, that are looking at some of these things as they're coming up on the policy decisions. There's a lot of healthcare things on the table. And the critical nature is actually having real live experience, right? To show policymakers, regulators, and so forth, why this is critical and how does that impact a real human being. It's not just a data point, so.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So, and I thank you for those kind words. I'm just so grateful that I have been invited to all of the meetings with open arms and allowed to listen to the science and learn and understand, so that we can help bridge the gap sometimes for patients. I'm sure you've experienced this. I mean, a patient has the diagnosis, they don't even really know what questions to ask, or it's all gobbledygook, new language. So it's important, I think, and I'm grateful to that we have such a good collaboration with the clinical community, and that wouldn't be the case without people like you, who really understand how we all are working collaboratively.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's see, what else do I want to ask you while I have you here? There's probably lots and lots of things, but there's so many things. What have you seen changed over the years? I mean, you've definitely had the sort of a front row seat to patient care and how the clinical community has changed and our ability to have treatments. What has changed? What do you see today that wasn't available, or how has the clinical practice changed over the years?
I think one of the big changes in the positive direction has been, I think care is becoming more patient focused. It didn't really used to be that way, but particularly with cutaneous lymphoma, this is really important. A patient comes in with multiple needs and multiple issues. And many patients don't really feel comfortable talking to you as the physician about these issues, because they think, well, you've only got a certain amount of time and you're busy, and let's talk about my medical things. And they don't really get into some of the other things that are critically important for their overall care. So I think the important thing from what I can see is we're trying to develop more holistic care. For instance, we have patient navigators, we have social workers meet with patients, on a regular basis, whether they need it or not. We have dietitians who work with patients to answer questions and help to guide, best practices for a healthy diet. We really try to engage family. We have opportunities for these kinds of, we do our own patient video, patients information videos. We have nurses go over the treatments with the patients and make sure they understand side effects. We try to have more of a dialogue. What I've really noticed, and I think it's partly related to the internet and the availability of your site and other sites, that patients can get information and oftentimes come in more informed, but also, with more questions. So I feel as though the doctor-patient relationship has really evolved, especially over the last 10 years, to be more of a partnership and more of a team approach. And I can see how that's really helping patients in so many different ways. And also I'm understanding different aspects of their life and how the treatments are impacting them. Whereas before I wasn't really, informed as much about that. So I think that's critically important. I think another thing that's happening is that there's much more clinical research than there used to be, partly because there's more drugs available and more opportunities to go on trials. We are trying to make it easier for patients to go on trial because that's still something that's difficult, in so many different ways we don't need to go into. But what we really need to focus on is how to streamline a process so that a patient can come in, get on a trial, and have a new approach to their disease without a tremendous hassle. And also that those opportunities are made available. So I would say that I can, in the last 4 or 5 years, I'd say probably about 40% of my CTCL patients, maybe more, are able to go on trials. Whereas say 15, 20 years ago, maybe it was 10%. So I think that that's certainly helping everybody. And hopefully in the future, that number will go up. So those are the two things that I think have really changed a lot. That's, I think, directly applicable to helping patients.
That's so exciting to hear, because I think one of the things, particularly in this disease, that is a challenge is all of that wraparound that you talked about. All of those quality of life impacts that are tangent. Okay, I didn't say that right. Anyway, ancillary to the actual clinical treatment of the disease, but have a huge impact on how the person is feeling. And because it's a visible disease, even if the disease itself is under control, but you can still see it if you've got it on your face, or there's a big emotional component to that.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And
yeah, these are things people find difficult to talk about, and sexuality is, of course, one of the ones that's really, really difficult. And oftentimes, it might be the nurse practitioner, it might be my practice nurse, it might be a social worker, whoever they feel that they can divulge that to. I think that is really critical, because those are difficult questions to ask, and it's difficult for people to talk about, but that's impacted in many of our patients. And we need to understand that better.
yeah.
So that's an example of how, we really need to focus in on what's important for the patients and find a way to have that communication.
Yeah. And I think that what I'm so excited about is what some of the work we're doing in collaboration with our umbrella group, the Lymphoma Coalition, that does a quality of life global survey of lymphoma patients. And we can pull out the cutaneous lymphoma, and the more people we get to answer that survey, it can raise issues that people don't necessarily talk about, but have an impact. And then we can come back to you within the clinical community and say, hey, this is what we are hearing. You may not be capturing that, but together then we can look at how do we help address some of those issues that could have an impact. And which I think is so exciting.
Exactly.
Right. And,
exactly.
and one thing I didn't mention is that you are the current president of the U.S. Cutaneous Lymphoma Consortium, which is one of the clinical professional organizations that brings everybody together and works collaboratively, which I think is also so important, for the clinicians to connect with each other, right?
Yeah, one of the goals of that organization, it's a physician organization, and we're trying to have a multimodality group of physicians engaged in education, and the ability to interact over patients with CTCL. And so what we're hoping to do is to draw in some of the hematologists who are not as expert in CTCL, and get them involved and create educational programs for them, and also create a network. So Meet the Experts kind of network where they can call in and talk to one of us if there's a specific patient issue. So we're in the future, the next year or so, we're hoping to actually have a virtual tumor board where we'll be able to present difficult and interesting cases and in an online format, a live online format, and get different opinions. Because as you know, there are multiple things that one can do at any point in the disease. And I think it would be helpful to hear what other people around the country think. So that's going to be really helpful. And the other thing is our registry. So we're trying to have a registry of patients with cutaneous lymphoma, which would represent the whole country. So every patient with cutaneous lymphoma could get entered into this registry. Their data could get entered, and we'll keep track of them. And over the course of their disease, we'll learn a lot this way, because we'll learn about, well, who's getting the disease, where they live, what kind of treatments they're getting, how they're doing. But then the other important part, which you just alluded to, Susan, is that we do have a quality of life tool in that as well. And so we'll be hearing directly from patients what they think is important. And all of this data, like from our registry and the Lymphoma Coalition and work that LRF is doing, and LLS, and these are organizations all dedicated to like hematologic malignancies of all sorts. All of these organizations are talking to each other and interacting, and continuing to really strive to get the information out there and give patients the best possible opportunity to have the information, but also to benefit from the research. So I hope that the USCLC will be able to unroll that registry in the next year.
Yeah, I think that's
Stay
really
tuned.
exciting. Yes. Well, and you have graciously invited, I'm part of the committee. So it's exciting. It's exciting. And I think that, again, that collaboration, right? That bringing all the pieces together really is what's going to move the field forward. Let me ask you, from your vantage point, what do you think, or what do you see as, you talked a little bit about potential cure or long range remissions, but what does the landscape look like going forward? What do you see on the horizon, and what is exciting to you that we haven't seen before?
I think the whole engineered cell therapy field, or immunotherapy, is really where we're heading. So CAR T cell, is one term for that. And that basically involves us taking your own normal T cells out and injecting a gene into those T cells that will allow them to specifically target to your tumor cells, or your CTCL cell in this case, and recruit an immune response. So basically kind of kill the cells. So it's creating a targeted killer using your own cells. And what's important about this is that once we make those cells in the lab, we inject them back into you by IV. Those cells can actually replicate themselves and stay in your system for quite a long period of time. So it's kind of like getting ongoing in-house chemotherapy, so to speak, right? And this is your own immune system, okay? So this has been really exciting in B-cell lymphoma, and of course, all the work has been done there. But now there is a number of clinical trials open specifically for T-cell lymphoma, and some of them have patients with MF Sézary in them. So I think we're just at the infancy of developing that. The other thing that's happening is, so that's the beginning of the technology. The second step is that we're able to actually take T cells from anybody. So just, blood donation T cells. And we're able to engineer those so that they won't reject your body when we inject them into your body, and put those same genes into them. So the benefit of that is it's basically off the shelf. So if I want to do CAR T for you, first I have to take your T cells out, send them off to a company that puts the gene in, then they come back a couple of weeks later, then I have to inject them. With these, what we call allogeneic T cells, they're off the shelf, they're already made, the company's already got them in vials frozen down. So if I decide I want to give you a treatment, all I have to do is order it and I get it. So this is actually better if patients kind of need a treatment quickly, right? So that's the second generation. And then the third generation is using multiple together. So you can see how this is building, building, building. But at the end of the day, what this is really trying to accomplish is to give you an immune reaction against your tumor cells, but have something hang around, you know, so that you have a lasting effect. Now, can this cure people? I think it's highly possible. I think that it's certainly a giant step in that direction. And it's also not chemotherapy, which is good for, you know, obviously is better than chemo, but also it's what we kind of call a one-shot deal. So you'd get it, and then you don't need to get anything for a while. Maybe you get a booster a couple months later or whatever, but it's not like going in and getting chemotherapy every week. So again, I think this is the most exciting approach that's taking a giant step toward where we want to be.
Wow, that sounds almost sci-fi-ish, right? But
it's a little
real.
bit of sci-fi. It's sci-fi in action.
Yeah, that's so exciting. And I think, you know, one of the things I tell folks that call us is, especially for people that may have more aggressive disease, that have tried different things and now something's not working. It's like, well, if you can, there's things on the horizon. So if you can find something that can bridge the gap for you, that for a little bit of time until some of these other newer technologies and so forth can come through the pipeline and come through the research process, you know, that's good enough for now. Right. But
right. I also, Susan,
go ahead.
can I say, I don't want to, I definitely want to say a word about stem cell transplant, just because it's such a negative concept for most people. Like everybody knows somebody who had a bone marrow transplant and didn't make it, you know, or had a horrible time, whatever. And it's kind of got a negative press. But I do want to say that stem cell transplant is a curative modality for this disease, like it is for other lymphomas. And we have learned a lot in the last 15 years about how to do a stem cell transplant safely. I'm talking about a stem cell transplant where you get cells from somebody else, not your own cells here, okay? The reason being that somebody else's cells is a new immune system that can fight against your cancer cells and kill them at all times, because that immune system lives in you after the transplant. Right. So new advances in terms of how to do the transplant, lower toxicity, and our ability to use half donors have all increased our ability to do this. And again, this is a curative modality for people who undergo this procedure. Probably about 60% of people stay in remission. It's a big deal, complicated, but it definitely is something to keep in mind, particularly with more advanced disease. And I would just tell people, you know, not to be afraid of it. If your doctor starts talking about it, don't leave the room right away. You know, kind of sit down, chill out, you know, think, you know, listen to what's being said, think about it. And it is really a viable strategy. I can say from experience, because I do a lot of transplants for patients with MF Sézary syndrome, and other institutions now do as well. So it's one of the things that we do, and I would say just keep it in mind.
Right. Well, and I think that that's a good point. And I think the other point then as well is, particularly for those folks that may be in that position where they're looking at, okay, what's next for me as a therapy? What might be the most impactful, and making sure that you are getting maybe other opinions, or searching out the centers that have the depth of experience, because this is a rare disease. So, you know,
exactly,
stem cell for a B-cell lymphoma or for Hodgkin's is not the same as doing a stem cell transplant for cutaneous lymphoma. So you really need to, you know, make sure you are at the right place, and being seen by people that
Exactly.
like you that do this all the time,
Exactly.
Right? But that's exciting. I'm excited for the future of, you know, how we're going to be able to manage this disease, and particularly for folks that are suffering from, you know, really challenging disease. There's a lot of hope out there, which is really,
Exactly.
really
I
great.
think that's important to remember. And thank you for saying that, to reiterate that for folks, because that's critical. And, you know, we're really hopeful on my side, and we're really excited about the new things that are coming out.
Yeah, that's well, and I think hearing it from you has really makes it real. You know, you're in the field, you're seeing patients every day, you see all the different iterations, and to hear that from an expert who is really out there on the front lines, I think gives people a lot of hope that, wow, you know, I steal this line that Dr. John Zick said at one of the meetings, I think, or in one of our programs. And he said, you know, somewhere around the world on any day at any time, there is someone doing research in cutaneous lymphoma. And I think for such a rare disease, that's an amazing thought, but it's really true.
It is. It is true. It is.
Yeah. Yeah. And the global community is so connected. It's really fabulous. And okay, I asked you all of these things. Okay, so here's my final question for you. What would you like to say to the patients who are listening? What would be your final words of wisdom or food for thought, or what would you like them to know?
I think I view cutaneous lymphoma as different from other diseases, because this is a chronic disease. And I often tell people who come in with early stage disease, this is like, you know, having psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease. Like, when you look around you, there's a significant number of people that have these chronic diseases. However, they're not stuck with the C word, which is, you know, the cancer word, right? So I think that at the very beginning with early stage disease, it's easy to be discouraged because the thing that differentiates you from psoriasis and inflammatory bowel disease, millions of people out there, is that you're stuck with the C word. Now, cancer isn't cancer. So cancer is a lot of different things. And I think early stage patients with this disease should expect, and of course the data supports this, to live a relatively normal life. They may have to live a life with me because they may be seeing me once a month, every 2 months, you know, every week, who knows how long. But the fact of the matter is that we can manage things. We have so many tools available to us today that we can manage this disease, and we can make your life as good as possible. And we're in there with you. You know, we know that this is a difficult struggle, and there are going to be good times and bad. But the important thing, I think, is to have hope and to trust that in the future that things are going to, you know, change as we go along. But more importantly, to try to live your life. I think that's critically important. Now, being in a great environment with doctors who understand your disease, or at least, you know, if you're in a distant place, collaborating with the experts on a regular basis is key in order for you to ensure that you're getting the right treatments. But that's easy to do now. You know, that's not an obstacle either. The only obstacle, I think, really for most people is just getting over kind of the emotional aspects of the disease, which can be very difficult. But I think you have a lot of tools available to you. You've got your patient forum is available, the listserv. You've got, you can hook up with people locally. I know the LRF and other groups, they do the talks in the communities, and there's just so many ways that you can actually hook up with people. So I just want to leave a word of hope for people. And I want to let people know that, yeah, this might be a cancer, but we've got a long life ahead of us, and we have a long relationship ahead of us. And if I'm continually surprised about the new things that come out every day, then you're going to be surprised too. So this is really an evolution and a journey. And I'm really happy that the journey, has included many more people than it used to include. And I think any of us, I just want to say, and I know all my colleagues around the country and probably around the world would say the same thing, that any of us are available. I have people emailing me all the time. Of course, I'm opening a door now, but really, honestly, any of us don't mind. We get emails from people. We are happy to help people. Anybody on that list, Susan's got the list of CTCL Centers of Excellence is on that list because we all said that we're willing to help folks. And you communicate through Susan if you're more comfortable, you can communicate to us, whatever. But I just want people to know that you have people out there that are looking out for you, and we're here for you.
Thank you. That's just a fabulous message. I so appreciate your taking the time to join us today, to share your wisdom, your knowledge, your insights, and the work that you do every day on behalf and for patients. We are really deeply, deeply grateful. So thank you so much, Dr. Foss.
Thank you.